Hi, this is Ann with Fiber Designs by Ann, and this is part 6 and the final part to the Dogs in the Landscape art quilt. I'm going to use a computer graphic here to explain how I'm measuring to make my binding. So in my little mock-up, we're going to pretend this is the backing, and this is the batting, and of course the quilt top. And when I measure before I cut off the batting in the back, I'm going to measure down the center, down the left side, and the right side. This quilt was so square after all that quilting, I was shocked, and I was really happy about it. And that came to 40 and 3/4 inches. Then I measured the other direction, and that measured 29.5 inches. And you'll notice here in the center that my landscape is higher on one side than on the other. So when I have those measurements, I'll cut it off. I'm not going to show how I square up a quilt because there's probably a lot of videos that show that, and I do it differently depending on the quilt. But like I said, this was really square and it was so nice. So I just trim away the outside, and if I need to stitch really close, I have it stitched already really close to the edge, like 1/8 of an inch. But if I, squaring it up, I cut some of that off, I will just go ahead and do a little hand stitch, running stitch to hold the 3 layers together. So I'm going to, now that I know the measurement for the sides, I'm going to measure from this point of the landscape up and that same point down. Because I'm using 2 different fabrics for my binding, I need to know that measurement. And of course it's not going to be the same for the other side because they're not the same, it's not the same length. So I'll measure there, and I know I'm going to put a 1/4 inch seam in my binding right at these points to join the 2 different fabrics. When I do the bottom, I'm just using a piece that is the same as the sides, and I will add 1 inch to each side. So in other words, I'll take my 29.5 and I'll add 2 inches to that. And that's what I'll be cutting for my bottom strip and my top strip of my butted corner binding. So next I'll talk about the binding fabric. These are the fabrics that I've chosen for the binding, and they seem a little different probably compared to what the quilt does, but I make very narrow bindings and I think they'll be great. So because I'm doing my binding divided at this point between the landscape and the sky, I have cut my strips, and I cut them 2 inches. Sometimes I cut them a little less than that because I want a really nice tight filled binding, but I cut these 2 inches, and this fabric is really thin, so I hope it doesn't give me any grief. It was kind of hard to even cut straight strips of it, but that's going to be down here, and they're going to join up here at that point, or around that point. So I cut 3 strips, so there will be a strip that will go across the bottom, across the top, and then I'll need a strip for each of the sides because I think it's a little bit more than half of one of the strips. So I'm going to take my 6 strips that I've cut for the tops, the sides, and the bottom, and I'm going to fold them in half. I'm going to press them in half. So now I've got my piece. My pieces for my binding. Let me scoot this over if I can get it here. So my binding is going to go a little tiny over here, but I'm going to try and get that to match between the landscape and the sky where I seamed it together. And I did just hand stitch this, but you could of course use the machine. I opened my seams out in this case just to save on the bulk that would be there, keep it down a little bit. So next I'll be measuring these for length to get them perfectly the same on both sides to help keep the quilt within square, and then I will be stitching them on the machine. So I'm at my machine and I'm using a walking foot. The binding has been lined up to the edge of my quilt and I'm using those clips. I think they're great for this task. And I want that binding to meet at the top and to meet again at the bottom, so I don't want to stretch it or pull it in any way. hoping that I've got that seam matched nice where the landscape and the sky meet. I'm going to go ahead and stitch right over that and just keep going to the end. And I'm pretty happy with that match. So my side binding is stitched down and finished, and I've added my bottom. I'm going to do the same thing on the top, but this is the bottom of the landscape. I've added my strip that I cut, the 29.5 inches plus 2 inches. So I'm hanging it over an inch at this part where you can see it. And I'm going to start not at the very end of that strip, but I'm going to start where my side binding is. So you can kind of feel the bump of the side binding under there. And that's where I'm going to start my stitching. And then I'm going to just stitch down. I have it nice and clipped so it won't stretch, and stitch down to the other end. I like to find a spot on my walking foot or whichever foot I'm using, and that sort of guides my seam allowance. It helps me decide how much of a seam allowance to make. Remember, I want the binding to be nice and full of that batting and quilt. And when I get to the end, I trust that there's only an inch hanging over. That'll be perfect. And I will stitch, and again I will stop just past the side binding that's finished and do a little back stitch, and that's where I will finish the stitching. I will not stitch all the way to the end of that extra 1 inch that's on the end of my binding. We'll put all the binding, pull all the binding around to the back side. The clips are great for this. Clip it all around, and I will do the butted corner binding technique. And there will be a link in the description and a link here so that you can go and see how I actually do the corners in my butted corner binding video. So here's the finished quilt. It has a label and it's ready to be gifted. I had to pin it to another quilt because it doesn't have a sleeve on it for this photograph. And I'm really happy with this quilt. It was a neat project. I always learn things making quilts from scratch. And I hope that you have followed along. If you have, I really appreciate that. I hope you enjoyed the series and that you will maybe be motivated to try some of these techniques and to make a quilt yourself. If you enjoyed this series, I hope that you will give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, I hope you will. Be sure and tap the bell so you get notifications for my most recent and upcoming videos. Until next time, this has been Ann. Thanks a lot for watching.